happening at the Nelson Mandela Foundation for two reasons. One, because Madiba touched my life and many of our lives so deeply as a young activist. And when I first heard Madiba's name, we didn't know how he looked because they banned his photograph. Some of you might remember, if it was ever printed, it had to be blocked out. But the bigger reason I'm so pleased is that when folks at Amnesty were encouraging me to be a candidate for this position, I had spoken to various people, and I'm one of the patrons of Future South Africa that was fighting the corruption and so on. And on Saturday morning, we were having a meeting in the boardroom. And I got here early, and before people arrived, I opened my computer, catching up on email before the meeting started, and there were 5 emails. All of them were from Amnesty, various people from Amnesty about, are you going to apply? The deadline is coming. And then I kind of put my hands on my head like this, thinking, oh my God, pressure, pressure, pressure. And then I turned to the left, I saw a portrait of Madiba, and I turned forward, and I saw a letter that Madiba wrote in 1962 to Amnesty International, thanking them for their support and solidarity. And I sort of thought, okay, the old man is speaking to me now. And so quite honestly, it was quite a spiritual moment for me. And I think that association gave me encouragement to take on what is a challenging role as the head of Amnesty International. I take on this role at a pretty challenging time for humanity, even though in December we will be 70 years of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Sadly, far too many powerful leaders around the world have been moving the agenda of human rights backwards, especially in the last couple of years. We're talking here from Donald Trump, and just to pick one issue, the breaking up of families at the borders, of immigrant families, one of the worst atrocities we've seen in a long time. We see in the Philippines violence by the government of President Duterte. In Hungary, we see the shrinking of civil society space. We see the Saudi government brutalizing the people of Yemen, and the list is much, much longer. But even though this might be the case, I entered this role with optimism. And my optimism comes from the very fact that there's been such a setback in terms of a range of human rights that you are seeing new energies, new resistance, and a much more powerful mobilization against the slide back in human rights. And yeah, we can look at young people and the role that they have been playing, because one of the visions that I have is to build a much more inclusive movement. And when we say we want to build an inclusive movement, we mean that we don't want anymore the idea that human rights is the responsibility of human rights organizations like Amnesty is not good enough. As Amnesty, we want to be able to work better in partnership with a range of organizations that are working on a day-to-day basis to advance human rights. In particular, we want to send a word to young people and youth leaders around the world that Amnesty wants to work with young people. We as Amnesty do not accept that young people are the leaders of tomorrow. We believe young people have to be the leaders of today. If they wait for tomorrow, with climate change, there might not be a tomorrow for them to exercise leadership. We want to send a special message today to the women's movement who have inspired activism against Trump through the Me Too movement and so on, that Amnesty wants to work much more closer with the women's movement globally. We also want to look at organizations and sectors that we have not worked as closely as we should have worked in the past, such as religious leaders. We believe that the religious leadership in the world might not agree on every single human rights value that an organization like Amnesty might put forward, but we agree on a substantial number of areas, and what we would like to see is the capability and maturity of all of us to be able to work around the issues that we agree on and to respectfully debate and continue to discuss areas where we have disagreements on. We would also say to the progressive business community that they have a responsibility to contribute to the fight on human rights, and we would be exploring that as well. Last but certainly not least, we really want to strengthen our relationship with the trade union movement. We have good relations, but we want to take it to a different level because we believe very strongly that labor rights are human rights and that we need to work with constituencies such as those. We also need to be much more bigger, right? Right now, Amnesty is impressive as a 7 million strong movement. For any of you who've tried to build membership movements, you'll know how difficult it is to build a membership of even 1,000. But to build a 7 million movement takes a lot of effort, and we want to expand that much, much more. Well, maybe I should, even though I've been told not to. I want to dream of a 70 million movement. We want to be able to make this movement owned by people. And the most important message that I want to make in this opening remarks is that we do not want human rights to be seen as the preserve and the responsibility of a handful of human rights activists as such. We will only win when, in fact, human rights is more dispersed and taken up by a range of institutions where we have overlapping interests. So in terms of the bigger, we have to actually become much more inclusive, and one of the things I'd like to pay tribute to my predecessor, Salil Shetty, and others who were here, is to really strengthen our presence in the global south. And that is where we have some of the biggest human rights challenges, and we need to be stronger, and that is something that is already happening. The last part of the vision, so if you want, it's bigger, bolder, and more inclusive, and I want to speak to the bolder part. If history teaches us anything, humanity, whenever it is faced a major injustice or a major challenge, those challenges only were able to be addressed effectively when decent women and men stood up and said enough is enough and no more. We're prepared to go to prison if necessary. We're prepared to put our lives on the line if necessary. And given the state of human rights in the world today, if ever there was a time that movements like Amnesty need to show maximum moral courage, it is now. And one of the things that I was very pleased when I addressed the Amnesty annual general meeting in Poland a few weeks ago, when I made the call for us to intensify civil disobedience, that was one of the things that was most well received. I want to conclude by saying that there's a quotation that has informed a lot of my thinking over the last couple of years from Martin Luther King, when basically he said, we recognize in psychology there's a very dominant term called maladjusted, but he went on to say, we don't want to be well adjusted to certain things in society that are unethical and unjust. And he says, I refuse to adjust myself to religious bigotry, racial discrimination, and importantly, to economic conditions that take necessities from the many to give luxuries to the few, when millions of God's children are smothering in an airtight cage of poverty in an affluent society. While he was talking about the United States in the 60s, it is 1,000 times more relevant in the US today, as it is 1,000 times relevant almost in every country around the world. But the point I'm making is we, even as the human rights movement, have to challenge ourselves about whether we have adapted to a range of things that we just shouldn't have adapted to. So I would like to come back to Madiba in concluding and leave you with two wisdoms which have really influenced my life. When Madiba once said, courage is not the absence of fear, but it is the triumphing or the overcoming of fear. I have done many actions for justice, even while I was at Greenpeace recently and so on. And I can tell you that I have moments of terrible fear. I mean, I was with Kyle there as part of Africans Rising in Cameroon, trying to document what was happening to the Anglophone-speaking parts, just 2 years ago. And I can tell you every roadblock that we got stopped at 2 in the morning, 4 in the morning. Your heart, moves to a different part of the body. in terms of panic, right? So it's not as if somebody like me who's been involved for a long time, since I was 15, doesn't feel fear, but it's about us recognizing that what we are fighting for is our children's future, and we need to summon greater courage. And the last quotation that I'll end with is Madiba saying, you know, when you take on a big challenge, it always seems impossible until it is done. And yes, right now, sometimes when I think about bigger, bolder, more inclusive, more impactful Amnesty, you know, it doesn't sound impossible to me. It sounds like a big challenge. And I think it's a challenge working with the wonderful colleagues in more than 85 countries around the world, and with many partners and allies. I hope that that's a vision I can help Amnesty achieve, and I look forward to working with thousands of people around the world who already have inspired me in helping walk this journey together. Thank you very much for your presence here today.